In this video, we are going to get introduced to the Google Maps geocoding API, and then we'll use the API to build an application that will take any address, return the formatted address, also the geographic coordinates of our address and the postcode. And then it will show the address on a map with a high zoom level and pinpoints the address using a marker. So first of all, let's have a look at documentation inside the Google Maps development website, okay, followed by documentation/geocoding. So in this website, you can find a lot of documentation about the geocoding API. So it will explain what geocoding is, okay, and then it will explain things like usage limits. By the way, we will need a server-side key, which we are already using. And for usage limits, with a free account or a free key, we can get 2,500 free requests per day, okay? And that's quite generous. If you think you need more than that, then you need to enable billing. So by clicking on that link and then follow the process. So now to use geocoding, the way to do that is by sending a request. So the request is going to be as a URL in this format. So inside the URL, we are going to have two main components, the output format and the parameters. So the output formats can be either JSON or XML. I'm going to come back to these in a bit. And then the parameters, they will include things like our address and our server-side key. Okay? So let's have a look at one example. So you can use this example by inserting the server-side key. So if I click on the key there and then choose a key to insert, so it needs to be a server-side key. So I'm going to click on insert. Now we can copy this URL using the icon, and then if we paste the URL on our address bar, then this is what we get. So this is a JSON output, okay? And we've got JSON because our output parameter is JSON. Later on, we're going to use an XML output, but for now, let's understand what JSON is. So JSON is a syntax for storing and exchanging data. It will return data in a human-readable format, and we can manipulate JSON using JavaScript. And the reason why is because, first of all, it's an object, and it contains objects and arrays inside. So we can use JavaScript and jQuery functions to manipulate it. So inside our JSON output or object, you can see things like the formatted address of the address we passed in the URL. Okay. You can also see the latitude and longitude of our address. You can see the postcode. Okay. So we'll understand later how to manipulate this file or object using JavaScript and jQuery and retrieve all the data we want. Now let's go back to the XML output. So it's exactly the same syntax. We're just going to replace JSON with XML. And now we are getting an XML file. So XML stores data in trees. Okay? So this is different from JSON, which will store data in objects and arrays. So JSON is closer in its structure to object-oriented languages. So this makes it very easy to import data from a JSON file into languages like JavaScript. Okay? So in our code later, we're gonna use a JSON output. Now let's go to our FTP, create a new file, and start building our application. So let's name it geocoding API.php. Okay. Now let's open the file using brackets. Okay, and let's copy the code from the previous file and change the title to geocoding API. So we're going to keep only the code where we created the map. Okay. Save this, and now let's open the file. Okay. So once we click on the geocode button, we are going to execute the function geocode address. Okay, so let's create this function. So first of all, we're going to need to create our URL. So we're going to store it inside a variable URL. Okay, so let's go back to the Google Maps website and get the URL from there. Okay, we can just click on that icon if we want to copy the URL. Okay, and let's place it inside quotes. Okay. Now, inside our URL, we want to use the address input by the user. So let's replace the current address, okay, with the address given by the user. So to do that, we're going to access this input and get the value of the input. So documents, get elements by ID. Okay. And the ID of the input is address. Then we need to use the value property to get the value of our input. Okay. So now let's start with something simple. Let's just open this URL. Okay. So we're going to use a method open of window, and we're going to pass the URL in the parameter. So let's save this, refresh our page. Okay, now let's try an address there. And click on the geocode button, and now we can see our JSON file. So our JSON object contains two elements, the results element, which is an array, and the status element, which is a string representing the status of our request. If the request is successful, the status is OK. So to manipulate this file, we're going to need a jQuery function called getJSON. So first of all, let's get jQuery and embed it in our file. So let's use Google CDN for that. And let's get jQuery, and let's copy it from there. Now, let's place this script just before our scripts. Okay, so the function is called getJSON. So the syntax is $.getJSON. So it's going to take a couple of parameters. So the first parameter is going to be our URL. And the second parameter is a function which will take one parameter, data, for example, okay, where we're going to store the JSON file. Okay, so let's write some code inside this function. So let's alert the status of our request. So to access the status, we're going to access the JSON file and then the status property. So the JSON file is data and then status. Okay, so let's save this. and let's refresh our page. So if we try to click on the button without putting any address there, the alert message is going to say 0 results. And the reason is because we didn't give any address. Okay. And you can see the status there, 0 results, and we don't have any results. Now if we try an address there, now the status is okay, and we've got results there. Now we are going to write some code to check if the request is successful. So if it's successful, then we are going to format the address like this and show the coordinates and postcode. Otherwise, if it's not successful, for example, if we don't give any address in the input, then we're going to show a message saying request unsuccessful. So you're going to need a div where we're going to place all these messages. So let's create a div right after the button. And let's give it an ID, output. Okay. So to check if the request is successful, we're going to use the status property of the JSON file. So if the status is okay, then we're going to write some code there to execute. Otherwise, we're going to have some other code. So let's start with the scenario where it's not successful. So we are going to access the output div using its ID. And we're going to change its HTML content to the message that we've got here, request unsuccessful. Okay. So let's save our code. And before we try that, let's just comment the line where we open the URL. Okay. So let's save and refresh the page. And now if we don't place any address in the input and click on the geocode button, we can see our message there, request unsuccessful. Okay.